Well, let's talk brains. So I'm going to share with you just some research, and really, as we're getting to the towards the end of the content in the semester, we've still got a little bit, but you all are going to be talking mostly next week. At least the graduate students will be. We're starting to get to some of the more emerging kinds of concepts when it comes to behavioral finance, and this is one of them. We're using neuroimaging to understand a bit about how people make decisions, and in particular, what parts of the brain are associated with it. Now, before I jump into this, I want to give you, as an appeal to authority here, a ringing endorsement of your presenter from the Wall Street Journal's Smart Money magazine. So this is quoting from the magazine. On a recent day in the basement of a campus lab, Russell James is working with a brain scanning machine that wouldn't look out of place in a top-notch hospital. James isn't, notice, isn't a mad scientist. So there's your ringing endorsement, not mad scientist, although I do like young Frankenstein and all of that. So what I want to do is walk through how these things work, not only so that you understand this experiment, but just so you understand if you read things, because oftentimes these kinds of experiments can get kind of popular press play. And I want you to understand what you can really see and what you can't really see in these sorts of experiments, so that when you see these things, even in the news, that you'll know a little bit more about them. So after we cover how these kinds of neuroimaging experiments work, we're going to look at the specific experiment that we ran. We're going to look at the results, and then some applications to actual financial planning practice. All right. So why do we do this? Why use neuroimaging, in this case, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to study financial decision making? Why don't we just ask people? Well, asking people can be really helpful and can be insightful, but it's not everything. Not all parts of decision making are known to the decision maker. So we ourselves may not know what's involved here. What we get to see with neuroimaging is we get to see actual activation of different regions of the brain. Now, those different regions of the brain can reflect different types of cognitive processes or emotional processes. So we can see, is this a mathematical process or an emotional process or a visual process or, various other things that can be observed about what is engaged with the decision making. So it's not just a matter of people not being truthful. They may not know these details. So let's take a look at the basics of how an fMRI experiment works so that you understand, not only for this experiment, but any kind of similar neuroimaging experiment, how it works. So this is what it actually looks like. We take people over to the Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute. It is over just west of the chemistry building there, in a basement, and we stick people in a magnetic resonance image scanner. So you actually do lay down in this, and then this sort of helmet thing that goes over the top, it has a mirror in it that acts like a screen. So anything you can put on a computer screen, you can put on that mirror so that people can see. Now, the way that it works is we then will give people response buttons, so that you would have a response button. In this particular experiment, we gave them 4 response buttons, so 2 on the left hand, 2 on the right hand. So you can make choices while you're seeing things in the brain scanner. Now, one of the reasons that this is actually a mirror here is because you can't have anything metal inside the scanner. The scanner is typically referred to as a magnet because it is an enormous magnet. And if you understand how a magnet works, if there's anything metal that gets close enough, it will go directly into the middle center of that scanner, which is where your head is. So you don't want to bring anything metal into the scanner. And then what we do is we associate those choices with blood oxygenation levels in different brain regions. So that's what we're actually seeing in the scanner. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that's what we are observing is what is happening to the blood oxygenation levels in all the different brain tissues as a person is making this decision. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, people spend a little bit of time in the scanner working with the buttons and the screen to acclimate to the environment because at first, like, this feels really weird, right? So the first thing we do is we do a very detailed scan of the brain. That takes a few minutes so people can just relax, get used to things. And then we run them through a few exercises, testing out the buttons, making sure they know how the buttons work and how the screen works, all that sort of thing. Then we start the experiment. All right. Now we will look at some technical details, but since this is not a neuroimaging class, although I have taught one of those before, it was the first class ever to be cross-listed as personal financial planning and electrical engineering. So kind of a weird combination there, but I'm going to try to make this very straightforward. So this was written while watching the Disney Channel with my 7-year-old daughter. She's no longer 7, but so here we go. So this is Vicki Boxell, and she's going to tell you about the two things you need to understand about neuroimaging. It's functional magnetic resonance imaging and a bold blood oxygen level dependent signal. So what is an fMRI picture? It's a picture of the brain. It's made up of thousands of boxes. Those boxes are called voxels. So a voxel is an abbreviation for a volumetric pixel. Like the screen here is made up of pixels, right? But a voxel is a volumetric pixel, meaning it's actually a cube. And so that's what the image looks like. Now, the voxels are small, usually about the size of one peppercorn. So if you want to kind of imagine how that works, that's about how small it is. You can make them smaller, but then each scan through the brain takes longer. So that's sort of the trade-off. Scan through the brain very quickly, but then the voxels are large, or we can scan through it very, very slowly, and then the voxels are very, very tiny. But roughly, in terms of this experiment, we're looking at that size of a brain. So what's important to remember there is that we're not looking at individual neurons, okay? We're looking at something about the size of a peppercorn, which is going to have thousands and thousands of neurons in it. So this is not a neuron level experiment. Those can be done, but not on people, because it sort of requires doing unpleasant things like opening up the back of the brain and hooking up wires to individual things, which people generally tend to object to. So when a lot of those neurons start to fire, the body rushes in oxygen to help. Okay, so we're not attached to the neuron, but what we're seeing is within this tiny little part of the brain, if a bunch of those neurons start to fire, that uses oxygen, so the body responds by rushing in oxygenated blood. Okay, this rush of oxygen comes through the blood and actually physically makes the voxels start to change color. As the blood oxygen increases, that little voxel will get redder and redder. And if this keeps going, it will become totally red from all of the oxygen in the oxygenated blood in that small area. So the neuroimaging machine can see the color change because blood with a lot of oxygen, that is, it's more red, is less attracted to magnets than blood without much oxygen. If you think of it this way, blood has iron in it, okay? Iron is attracted to a magnet. You put an oxygen molecule on top of that iron, it is less attracted to the magnet. This paramagnetism is what we are actually observing in the brain scanner. This is what is known as a bold signal. It is blood oxygen level dependent. So the idea being here that if we have a high level of oxygenation, then we're going to have less attraction to a magnet. If we have a low level of oxygenation, then we will have more strong attraction to the magnet. And that is the signal that is observed. So the way it works is we want to estimate the likelihood that either a single voxel or a group of voxels is activated by something that the participant is seeing or something that they're doing or a decision that they are making. So that's the basics of it. There's other stuff that are a bit more complicated. The machine itself is very impressive. It is like I said, it's a giant magnet. It actually has to use liquid helium in order to get cold enough to reach the superconductivity levels that are required for the machine to work. The magnet is always on. It doesn't turn on and off because it's got to keep this sort of level of frozen. You can actually, in the case of an emergency, turn it off. There is a giant red button. You can hit that button and it will shut the magnet down. It shuts the magnet down by releasing all of the liquid helium. That costs about $180,000. So you do not hit the red button unless it is definitely an emergency. The emergencies typically involve anything that is where there is metal that gets into the room, which is why there's a metal detector before you go into the room. We may do a metal scan as well, just to make sure that nothing metal gets into the room. Because again, if you're familiar with the Avengers and Magneto, it's the same kind of thing. You don't want to let any metal into the room because the magnet can control that metal in very unpleasant ways. All right, so here's what you need to understand about what this data looks like. The fMRI data doesn't start out like this. It doesn't start out like, oh, you did this decision and here's the part of the brain that was active. Because this is what the brain looks like when that decision takes place. In other words, the signal is noisy. One of the reasons is that the brain is noisy. The brain's always thinking about doing stuff. It's regulating your body temperature and your heart rate, and it's thinking about 12 different things, even consciously or subconsciously, and then you add another task onto it. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on in there. Also, the scanner itself is noisy. It's not a perfect measurement instrument, and so we do get some noise from that. So we have these two issues. That brain is noisy, it's constantly active, it's constantly firing, constantly receiving input, constantly sending instructions. So even if we are measuring that level of activity, it's going to be very noisy. Even conscious thought is scattered. I've been talking about neuroimaging. How many of you thought about something other than fMRI in the last 3 minutes? Well, of course, I mean, most of you are online doing something else at the moment, but you get the idea. So how do we design for noisy brains? Here's how the research works. You've got to do it through contrasts, that is comparison of two things, and repetition. So this is one thing to keep in mind about all neuroimaging research that generally is not reported when the newspaper articles report the discoveries. And that is this, that all neuroimaging research has to compare one type of activity to another type of activity. Because if we say, what is happening in the brain when you engage in X, everything's happening in the brain when you engage in X. Your brain's doing all kinds of stuff all the time. However, what we can identify is what is different between what the brain is doing during task A as compared to what the brain is doing during task B. Now, the reason this gives us that cleaner image is all of the kind of normal stuff that the brain is doing, it gets filtered out, right? Because let's say, your brain's busy regulating your heart rate and your temperature, let's say. Well, it's going to be doing that both in task A and in task B. So if we're only looking at the differences between task A and task B, well, then we're not going to see that because that was happening during both of them. So this is how we're able to more precisely identify, but we are not actually identifying what takes place in the brain when you do task A, because that's the answer, which is everything. What we're identifying is only the difference between two tasks. So every neuroimaging result is the result of a comparison of two kinds of activities. So it is not something that says, here's what happens in the brain when you do X. It's always when you do X as compared with when you do Y. So we always want to think of this research in terms of contrast. Take an image of task A, an image of task B, and then we subtract the image of task B from the image of task A, and that gets us our activation. So you can think of this as cognitive subtraction. We use a comparison to isolate an activity. That's not actually what cognitive subtraction looks like. I just was a funny example. All right. So the comparison task, and this is very important, has to be identical except for one variation of interest. Now, this is true in all kinds of experimental research, but particularly important here. Because if you have task A and task B is different in 4 different ways, and you say, well, this is how the brain is acting differently during task B versus task A, we don't know which of those 4 different things that were different about task B are responsible for this difference in activity. So we want to have just one difference. Okay, so that's your background. Here's the actual experiment in this case. So we did an fMRI analysis of choosing and changing financial advisors during an advisor-intermediated stock market game. So essentially, we're trying to explore this. What brain regions are differentially activated by decisions to change a financial advisor? What does it look like when you fire your financial advisor? Or at least as close as we can get to it in an experiment. Here's how it works. This is what the participants actually saw. So technically, what they saw was a reverse image of this. We started out with this text, and then people said, that's really bright, I'm getting a headache. And so then we reversed it and made it black with white text, and then that problem went away. So here was the setup. Next, you'll play a stock market game. The participant who accumulates the most money in this game will be paid $250. By the way, everybody was paid to participate in this experiment. I'm trying to remember, I think we paid people $50, something like that. And for different experiments, we would try to get different groups. Like, for example, for this experiment, we excluded anyone who was from financial planning or actually anyone from the business school as well. And that's because we wanted them to, you'll see how the experiment works here in a moment. We wanted them to switch the advisors. The advisors had different strategies. If you actually know how investment works, you would pick one strategy and you would never switch, because that actually gives you a greater return over time, right? Which means we would have just spent $600 to put you in the scanner and you didn't engage in the behavior we're trying to measure. So that's why we kicked all of the folks out. But we also wanted participants to be engaged in winning the game. So give them money. That's the only way we know how to engage people in financial planning. And it works, so it's all good. Instead of picking stocks, you will select among 4 financial planning firms. These advisors will invest in stocks for you based on one of 4 strategies. You may change firms at any time, as many times as you like. There is no cost to change firms. Notice we're hinting you can change a lot, because that's the actual behavior we're wanting to observe in scanner. So here's what some of the participants saw. The 4 financial planning firms are A, the Able firm, B, the Baker firm, C, the Clark firm, and D, the Davis firm. I'll walk through this first setup. There's multiple groups of advisors they will see at different parts during the experiment. The Able firm follows a trends strategy, immediately selling stocks that are falling and buying stocks that are rising. The Baker firm follows a growth strategy, buying stocks in companies that are growing. The Clark firm follows a value strategy, buying, quote, cheap stocks in companies with a lot of assets but low stock price. All advisors in the Clark firm are certified financial planners. They may not know what that is, so the CFP must have years of experience, a college degree with investment coursework, pass a series of rigorous exams, and continually complete ongoing education in investing. Finally, the Davis firm follows an income strategy, buying stocks and companies that pay high dividends income. All advisors in this Davis firm are certified financial planners. Here's the setup. After each round, you will see your percentage return, gain or loss for that round, and the overall market return for that round. You may change advisors at any point by clicking on the relevant button. And again, if you were laying down, the idea is that you have the two buttons here, and those buttons are going to correspond to what you're seeing on the screen, right? Button 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's what that's describing. We actually had them run through some experimental tests ahead of time to make sure they understood how the buttons would work. Here we go. Choose your initial advisor now. You may change at any point by pressing the appropriate button. Now, some subjects didn't see this group of strategies and advisors. They instead saw this group of strategies and advisors. Part of the results we were looking at, we didn't find anything significant there, but we wanted to see if you notice between these two, these are the same stock image models. They're just either dressed professionally, more professionally, or a bit more casual. So we're alternating business casual and more formal attire. All right. So it might look something like this then. This round, the market was up 1.5%. Your investments were up 4.8%. So we first started out with 6 rounds of these market return presentations, where each time they would see this round, the market was up a certain amount, your investments were up a certain amount. After 6 rounds, there's a break with instructions above the advisor images, just to remind them, you can change your advisor at any point by clicking the relevant button. The market will begin again in a moment. So again, they can change advisors during the process of the game. They can change advisors during these breaks as well. So we run through actually 6 rounds of this, 6 sets of 6 rounds each, and then we introduce them to a new set of advisors. Now, we're not varying race, we're not varying gender, we are varying clothing. Everything else we're just trying to keep identical. So none of those variations are taking place here, but now we get a new set of advisors. One of the things you notice about the new set of advisors is before, value and income were the CFP advisors. Now the trends and growth are the CFP advisors because we're trying to equally balance those things as well. So folks played 6 more sets of 6 rounds for a total of 72 rounds of the stock market game. Now, I'm going to tell you how the game works, which now disqualifies you from participating in this experiment. The game was rigged. Each round in a set had similar returns. The returns progressed in this sequence. There's a flat market where the advisor would outperform the market by 1 to 5% for 6 rounds. Then the flat market where the advisor would underperform the market by 1 to 5%. A rising market where they outperform, then a rising market where they underperform the market, a falling market where they underperform, and a falling market where they outperform. And then after we introduced the second set of advisors, this was the sequence. They essentially got all the market variations they hadn't got before. They got the different variations, but in a different sequence. So markets going up, and they're either outperforming or underperforming the market. Markets falling, outperforming, underperforming. Markets flat, outperforming, underperforming. Now, the reason that we had to do this is because we're trying to make comparisons of what is happening in the brain across people. So we need what they are seeing on the screen to be identical. So we're just trying to see what is the difference when they decide to switch to the advisor. So we've got to keep everything that everybody is seeing on the screen exactly identical. That's why we can't have them having different returns based upon what they actually chose, even though that was their perception as to what would happen. Okay, that was the experiment. Here's some of the results. First, just kind of what people chose. This was the frequency of advisor switching during varying returns. When the market as a whole was going up, people were less likely to switch advisors. When the market was flat or falling, people were more likely to switch advisors. Now, by the way, these are equally balanced in the amount of time that the advisors are outperforming or underperforming the market. But when things are good, even if the advisor is underperforming, people tend to roll with it. Then you notice that even though it was equally balanced on the amount of time that the advisors were outperforming the market or underperforming the market, about 75% of the time that they fired the advisor was underperforming the market. Not a shock there. Sort of expect that to happen. Some of the other things we looked at, one was the share of time in the market. And also the share of the initial advisor selections before the market opened. People spent more time with the CFP folks than with the non-CFP folks, about 2 to 1. But that was actually less than the share that selected the CFP advisor before the market opened. That was about 3 to 1. And so the idea is people gravitated towards the advisor that had the credentialing. But once the market started, they shifted away from that a little bit. Some other things here, the people tended to prefer the growth strategy, less preference for the income one. But again, we have really wide differences on the initial selection, but once the market starts, people tend to shift around. We didn't get any results of interest on the more casual versus the more formal. There was no real difference there. It was pretty close to 50-50. And also we were comparing age. So we had the younger advisors versus the older advisors. Although the older the folks were more likely to start out with the older advisors. And these participants, a lot of these were actually grad students. So this is a relatively younger audience, 20s and 30s for the most part. We've done some other experiments with older participants, but not this particular one. But even so, we started out about 2 to 1 for the older folks. But notice once the market actually started, that kind of disappeared and then kind of got closer to 50-50 on this particular experiment. All right, so that was just how people responded. Let's now look at the neuroimaging. So what are we comparing in this neuroimaging? Well, this is a little bit different because we are wanting to see what happens when they fire the advisor. So what we're comparing is the switching period. That is, we're looking at what is happening in the brain during that 1 second prior to them deciding I'm switching. Okay. And we want to compare that to the quiet periods. So the quiet periods, any period that is more than 5 seconds before they decide to fire an advisor, and also more than 1 second after they have fired their last advisor. So this is the comparison. We want to say this is what happens in the brain right before they fire the financial advisor, as compared to everything's good and they're not close to doing that. So what does this actually look like? What areas are more engaged during the switching than during the non-switching quiet periods? So let me show you what this looks like. We'll do a bit of a flight through the brain on this video. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start at the nose and we're going to work back through the head, and you can kind of see there the eyeballs showing up, and then wherever you see the colored areas, this is where we are getting more activation during these switching periods than we are during the quiet periods. Now, what you're looking at here is that for every single participant, as part of the data analysis, we get the data that shows what's happening in this person's brain, and we take that brain and we have to squish it into an identical size brain so that we can lay all of these images on top of each other, even though we're looking at images of many, many different people. So that's part of the process where we kind of stretch or squish the brain to fit into a sort of box that matches all of the where all of the different brains match. Different people have different size brains, different genders have different sized brains, and so you have to make that all sort of structured. In fact, in this case, we didn't because different genders have different sized brains. It's easier just to run everybody of one gender because then you don't have so much stretching and squishing you have to do. So in this experiment, everybody was female that participated in the experiment. So what does this mean? We get these results. What does it mean that we see these different areas of activation? Well, the way we figure out what it means is we first see, okay, this is clearly an area of the brain statistically that is activating, not just in one person, but across all the people. We see statistically, oh no, whoever it is, I mean that this area of the brain is turning red. Now, what you'll always read is this area of the brain lights up. It doesn't light up, how the brain works, but it does turn red because the body rushes oxygen to the area. So the first area that we found that activated was the dorsal anterior cingulate medial frontal cortex. Now what you're looking at here is, well, this is washed out a little bit, but I guess you can see it there. This is just different views of the brain. So this is looking from the side of a person's head. This is looking from the back of their head. And this is looking from on top of their head. So this red area that I've circled, that's the exact same area, right? It's just how it looks like for the back of the brain, side of the brain, top of the brain. Okay, it's all the same area. Now, the way we know what this means is we say, okay, this area of the brain is clearly engaged when people are getting ready to fire their financial advisor. So we then look at other research to find out what other kinds of activities engage this area of the brain. So, for example, in this particular area, this is an area that's been implicated in previous studies in error detection. This includes observing errors made by others. It may be limited to detecting loss-related areas. So this is the idea that we can identify where. Okay, so there used to be a concern that maybe we're not exactly right on what areas of the brain do what things. Because originally, the way that we knew it for sure is we would have patients with brain damage, and we would see how are they behaving differently. Right? We could identify this area of the brain was damaged. How are they behaving differently? So that gives us pretty good confidence. We also have these neuroimaging things that say, well, when you're doing, say, math or error detection, this part of the brain is engaged. We also have now what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Anybody heard that? You know how to explain. Just anybody heard TMS? Okay. So transcranial magnetic stimulation. So here we're just looking at the magnetic properties of the brain, right? TMS is where you actually send a magnetic impulse through a very specific part of the brain because it impedes the normal synaptic activity. So you can see what happens when I mess with this particular part of the brain. Let me show you an example of what this looks like.
If we start at the back of the brain, we've switched off my visual cortex, so made me unable to see things. If we move a little bit forward in the brain, we've interfered with people's ability and my ability to see faces. A little bit further forward, we've interfered with the ability to perform actions. Start moving your finger.
Quite odd.
It's not your finger anymore.
It's not my finger anymore.
We've interfered with the ability to compute with numbers.
6, 7, 8. Oh,
Okay.
yeah. Yes. That's
We've
the
interfered with the ability to speak.
London Bridge. London Bridge. London Bridge is falling down.
You think of something you can do, and we've basically interfered with it with this machine.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
So what's the problem?
I don't know.
Okay, so just to give you a quick example of kind of what that looks like, and mostly just to freak you out. So actually, there's more and more things, and TMS has found some useful applications in treatment of some different mental conditions as well. There's other things that are similar. There are. It's probably the wrong word. So you can use a 9-volt battery, essentially what it's powered by. You can stick a thing on your head that runs that electrical current through a very specific part of the brain. And if you align it correctly, then it will run a mild electrical current through a very narrow part of the brain that does a particular function. Now, what that does is you have your synapses, and you think of a synapse as sort of it's like an electrical connection that goes right and makes that connection. Well, what that does is it basically sets those synapses as sort of at 50%, like ready to go, right? And so you can actually overclock a brain like you can a computer. You can make it hyped up and more intense, more ready to go. And so you can change, for example, scores on cognitive tests if you, with a 9-volt battery by doing this. It's kind of what you're doing chemically when you use caffeine. It does the same sort of thing where it sort of makes those synapses more ready to fire by sort of putting them at, instead of starting at 0%, waiting for them to get to 100%, it puts them up to about 50%. So they're much more likely to fire. Now, I go through all that just to say that we have a high level of confidence that certain areas of the brain are engaged in certain kinds of activities. We know that because you can use TMS, interfere with that area of the brain, and that activity will be very difficult to do or impossible to do. Okay, so that was the first thing we found. That we've got this error detection taking place. This is the color version. Just showing you what that looks like. Again, from the side view, this is the person's nose and eyes here. The back view, top, and the top view of these same activities. In this case, the top view of just this one area of activity. So this is sort of a slice here, and a slice here. Yeah.
How are you able to find somebody else's research that had the random chance to it affected the brain at the same spot?
Yeah. So, right. Great question. So here we go. Dorsal, I found, for example, hey, we've got the dorsal anterior cingulate is going crazy. And so what does that mean? And so I go to this thing called Google Scholar, and I put in dorsal anterior cingulate, fMRI, and it gives me, hey, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex shows fMRI response to internal and external error signals. Yeah, well, actually, it's just Google, but I will present it to you as my personal genius. But yes, so yes, this is now obviously 23,000 results, and that kind of thing. But you can look at those results. Now, what I will tell you is that this is of some interest. It turns out that what is of more interest is not just that you get the exact same area activating. It's when we get a study, and I'll show you this in a minute, where we actually had simultaneously 3 different areas of activation. And then you find another neuroimaging study that had those same 3 simultaneous areas of activation. That's where we get really interested. We'll actually see that happened here. But here, this is just one basic area. Any other thoughts or comments? So the other thing we had was the right and left inferior parietal gyri. Now, what do these things do? As you can tell, these are two areas now. So we've got the side view, which looks like just one area. But if you look at it from the back of the brain, it's two areas. Look at the top of the brain, you can see it's two areas, right? That is implicated in number processing tasks. We know this because damage impairs the ability to manipulate numbers, and also transcranial magnetic stimulation will slow number comparisons. That's what you were just seeing on the screen there. Somebody getting a TMS interference with their inferior parietal gyri while they're trying to count. Makes it harder. And then the final area, here's the color version, was the right and left middle frontal gyri of the prefrontal cortex. What is that used for? That is used in predicting immediate contingent outcomes. It's also used in the recall of numbers and in mathematical calculations. As I mentioned, it is interesting to say, okay, we've got three areas, and here's what each of the three areas do. A more powerful approach is if we can find some other task that simultaneously activates all of those regions. And the reason we get excited about that is because that suggests we've actually got a similar network that is being engaged here. Because the brain is super complicated. Oh wait, I have to pause for a moment here. So you may have heard or seen from Hollywood the really compelling idea that we only use 10% of our brains. I like one neuroscientist's response to that. Really believe that. Let me take out part of your brain and let's see how you get along, right? Where does this idea come from? The idea comes from a bit of truth that's completely misunderstood. That bit of truth is that if you take an image of the brain and what it is doing in a particular part of a second, about 10% of the brain is active during that particular part of the second. If a larger part of the brain were active during that particular fraction of a second, would pass out because you don't have enough oxygen in the brain for everything to simultaneously fire all the time. So in one particular microsecond, yes, probably only 10% of the brain is at that point active. But if you want to take a really long period of time, like, oh, I don't know, 3 seconds, then you're going to get the brain being pretty active in a lot of different areas. Yeah.
Is that how we get headache, or sometimes if we use too much of our brain?
I have no idea. I don't think so. But you know, for the most part, what we know about the brain and about cognition is that honestly, it's like a muscle, right? So, and this relates to behavioral finance because, for example, in experiments, if you have people engage in resisting temptation, okay, they will eventually kind of hit a cognitive exhaustion where they just wear out and there's, okay, no, I'll just have the thing, right? Which is why, like, if you have a tempting option around you all the time, you'll eventually wear out. If we make people engage in a difficult task, mathematical task, resisting temptation, whatever, just like if I have you lift weights, you will, at a certain point, you'll get tired, okay? So there is that sense of exhaustion. However, it is also true, just like with lifting weights, that if you do that particular activity repeatedly, it builds up strength. Okay? So this becomes important when we look at, say, for example, cognitive abilities and cognitive decline during older years. Cognitive decline during older years, it's basically, to a large extent, just like muscles, it's a use it or lose it proposition, right? So if you have somebody who retires, does not socially engage, doesn't do anything that is cognitively difficult, their cognitive abilities will more rapidly decline. In the same way, physically, if you have someone who just sits in a chair and doesn't move and doesn't work out, what will happen to their muscle tone? It will decline, right? It's the same basic idea. It is also the case that we see better long-term older age cognitive trajectories with people who have a higher level of education. Part of that reflects the just having built up this sort of cognitive strength over time. There's another reason why, and it relates to this, there's another reason why we usually want to use younger participants in our neuroimaging experiments. Here's why. When you are younger, and I have you engaged in a particular task, the area of engagement will be relatively small. So it's easier for me to pinpoint which area is the focus point of that activity. As people get into older years, they may score just as high on that same cognitive test, but neurologically, they do it differently. They actually engage larger parts of the brain in order to accomplish the task, okay? So it's almost like they are using larger muscle groups to lift that weight. So the idea of the cognitive decline isn't just a matter of the individual synapses changing. That can be compensated essentially by sustained effort over time, where the brain learns, okay, this is really hard, so we're going to use more neural real estate to engage in this activity, more effort, if you will. And so, again, an older person may have the exact same cognitive score, but it looks differently in the brain. It will be more spread out because they will engage more activity. There are different kinds of activities that engage larger parts of the brain. That's why, for example, when we talk about the elephant and the rider, your prefrontal cortex, thing that does math and plans ahead, that's actually a pretty small part of the brain. It's just the sort of part that got added on top here, okay? It gets tired. Whereas the elephant side is big chunks of neural real estate. Emotion, vision is a huge part of neural real estate. And so that's why the elephant side is much more robust, much stronger. Even though, of course, the rider side thinks it's always in charge. It's actually doesn't take up that much neural real estate. It's one of the reasons why, since doing this, I try to create PowerPoints that have images of emotional faces that match the concept I'm trying to present. Because having watched it in the brain scanner, if you show an emotional face in the brain scanner, it engages huge parts of neural real estate, right? So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm fighting over your neural real estate with what's on your laptop at the moment. So it's a losing fight, but still, I try to engage. Right. So you notice that we have these three different kinds of areas that are activating. We've got inferior parietal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior parietal gyrus, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. What does all of these simultaneous firings, what other studies does it look like? It looks like studies of gambling when people decide to stop chasing gambling losses. Now, if you remember from early on in the semester, chasing losses, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is actually the only characteristic that distinguishes problem gambling from other kinds of addictive behaviors. It is this tendency of chasing losses. Remember, chasing losses is the idea of, oh, I have lost money, I'm down by $1,000, I'll do a double or nothing. because I don't want to lose, right? That's the loss aversion. Like, it's not an advantageous gamble, but I'm willing to be risky so that I can get away from having a loss. That tendency of chasing losses is what will turn gambling into a fun diversion weekend event to completely destroying all of your finances, your life, getting you into debt, all that sort of thing. It's really bad, right? And so in gambling research, they're very interested in this decision to chase losses, or in this case, to stop chasing losses. What we see in other research is that we got almost identical activation in the decision to stop chasing losses in gambling and the decision to fire your financial advisor in a stock market game. We'll talk a bit more about what that means in a moment. Let me now flip around to the other side. What was different about the non-switching or quiet periods, right? What was taking place in the brain? What was taking place in the brain that was different during these non-switching periods, these quiet periods, when they're not thinking about firing the financial advisor? So again, this is the flight through the brain, and just so you're aware of what these images are. This is a standard sort of brain structure, and we squish and stretch all of the brains into match this one structure so that the activations will appear in exactly the same areas. That's part of the data processing. And so we see the areas that are relatively more active. You notice there's not many areas that are showing up here in terms of things that are being relatively more active until, I think if I recall correctly, we'll see, there we go, right there, right at the very back of the brain. What's back here? What's back here in general is vision. But in our particular experiment, it was a specific kind of vision. And that is, that is vision that is used for, okay, well, this just shows you the neuroimaging results, and we ignore the stuff related to button pressing, is that we get fusiform gyri activation, which is a face-specific region. It's a region of the brain that only responds to pictures of faces, also responds to some kinds of text, but the text wasn't different here, so we know that's not the case. And some other areas that responds differentially to faces, especially emotional faces. All right, so let me summarize what we're seeing here. When people are getting ready to fire their advisors, the brain is engaged in number comparisons, math, numbers, error detection, contingent outcomes. What are they doing during the quiet period? They're looking at the advisor's faces. Not doing math. They're not doing math comparison. So switching was preceded by error detection and number comparison. Loyalty periods were associated with focusing on the images of the advisors themselves. Because again, those are both on the screen at the same time, but we know what they're looking at. All right. So what are some actual practical implications here? Well, as an advisor, question is, how do we encourage those loyalty periods and to avoid those switching periods? During the loyalty periods, what are people doing? They're focusing on the people, not the numbers. During the switching periods, what are people doing? They're identifying advisor errors through number comparisons. So as an example, pulling this quote from a book from Dina Katz, a former faculty member here. She says, "We always provided quarterly and year-to-date performance returns in our reviews. Everyone does. One day we asked ourselves what message we were sending our clients by listing short-term performance when we are constantly preaching the need for a portfolio with a long-term horizon. It really made no sense, but of course, peer pressure is mighty. We argued over this point for months until we took Nike's advice to just do it. We did. We waited for the barrage of calls questioning about the absence of short-term performance numbers. We received 3 calls, all of them just asking if we had forgotten a line in the review. When we explained, they agreed, yeah, it wasn't necessary. We took the same tack when we omitted the page of index returns in our quarterly reviews. Although we were perfectly willing and prepared to discuss it with any clients who asked, no one called. They eliminated the number comparisons. Another example. Roy Dilberto admits that at his firm, they used to beat clients over the head with education in modern portfolio theory. You all probably know what that feels like. They'd explain Sharpe ratios, alphas, betas. They would, in fact, have a lengthy discussion about whether beta was dead. Most people didn't know what beta was, let alone whether it was dead or not. Furthermore, they didn't care. According to Roy, we finally shot this sacred cow. Clients only want to know two things. One, are you competent? Two, do you put their interests first? This idea of getting clients away from number comparisons and getting them focused on the advisors as individuals seems to fit what we're seeing in the neuroimaging. We also see that right before people fire the advisor, they engage in identifying errors, error detection. How can we reduce the perception of advisor error? Because when people are seeing underperformance, they're thinking the advisor is screwing up. How do we reduce this perception of error detection in what the advisor is doing? 3 strategies: avoid losses, encourage ignoring losses, or the favorite behavioral approach, reframe losses as something other than an advisor error. How do we avoid losses? Well, good luck with that. Even a superior strategy will never outperform a comparison index every hour, day, month, or year. If investors are compensated for risk, then avoiding loss is itself a losing strategy. What we do. We can encourage ignoring losses. Checking the market less frequently results in increased market participation and increased returns. We can also say, well, if you're not going to just set it and forget it, then let's reframe the loss. Changing advisors was neurally similar to a decision to stop chasing gambling losses. That is, rejecting that double or nothing bet when you're down. What does gambling research tell us about why people don't stop chasing losses? Now, the only difference between market participation and gambling is that gambling is a losing proposition, right? That's how the casinos make money, right? Stock market participation over time should be a winning proposition if you've got a long enough horizon of time. So we all of a sudden are super interested in gambling research. Why? Because gambling research neurologically is exactly the same thing we were seeing in the brain scanner. Notice that from gambling research, those who don't stop chasing losses, that is, those who have a gambling problem, do not have reduced numerical ability or any misunderstanding of gambling odds. It's not a math problem. In fact, I will tell you this, confession time here personally, I don't do any gambling, but my favorite podcasts are daily, weekly podcasts on NFL football gambling. Why? Because I like statistics and I like football. And that show has both statistics and football. Never placed a bet, never have interest in a bet, but I love the math side of things. I say that. Say people who have gambling problems are not bad at math. They actually are pretty good at knowing all of the math and the odds. That's not the problem. The problem is they're prone to cognitive biases. The common characteristic of these biases is a reinterpretation of losses. Notice, the problem gambler is not constantly losing, but constantly nearly winning. Okay. For example, slot machine players will interpret their machine later paying out to another player as a near miss. Poker players are unlikely to play for an extended period without experiencing a near miss, and such near misses are a major reason for chasing losses. in electronic gaming machines, it is possible to see almost every outcome as a near miss. By the way, for any NFL football team fans, one of the features of losing money on an NFL football game, in 90% of the cases, they almost won. If it wasn't just for those 2 or 3 plays, right? And so you're not constantly winning, you're not constantly losing, you're constantly nearly winning. In the same ways I mentioned before, a slot machine isn't something where you put money in, you press a button and it goes loser, loser, lose. No. It's, a cherry, and oh, it was a lemon. So close. You almost, what happened? So close. No, this is loss. What is the reinterpretation of that loss as a near win? We're reinterpreting the loss as something other than a loss. It makes it attractive. That makes people continue to gamble. Other examples: gambler's fallacy. Purely random event is more likely if it has not recently occurred. This is not true, known as the gambler's fallacy. Other research has noted an inclination to believe that success was approaching due to near miss experiences. Quoting from the study, there was a noticeable tendency to think of gaining information from a near miss, even when the outcome could only be a matter of chance. So, for example, on a fairly balanced roulette wheel, the casinos will post what numbers have come up on that wheel before. What is the informational value of that posting? 0. It's a random event. But gambler's fallacy, you might use that to feel like you have an edge, and then that will cause you to participate. How does this apply to our conversations? We have approaches, investment heuristics that help with loss reinterpretation. 2 of those approaches are bracketing and dollar cost averaging. What is bracketing? Bracketing is conceptualizing returns in larger blocks. In other words, over longer periods of time, and ignoring short-term variation. Let's look at what it looks like in experiments. One experiment shows this. They use these instructions in the middle of an experiment where people would make a decision to take an advantageous gamble or not. The instruction was this: all that matters is that you come out on top in the end. A loss here or there will not matter in terms of your overall portfolio. In other words, you win some and you lose some. Giving those instructions in the middle of a game where people could repeatedly choose to participate or not participate in an advantageous gamble resulted in decreased physiological anxiety in response to experienced losses as measured by skin conductance response. And also in a neuroimaging study by amygdala activation, which is your fear center. So the fear center calms down, and the micro sweat or stress anxiety response goes down. This particular methodology, Dr. Guillemette used when he did his PhD, and I was his advisor for that. And so that's, I usually don't encourage PhD students to do neuroimaging research because it takes a couple of years to know how to do that data analysis. But skin conductance response, you can do that very quickly. And analyze that data very quickly. So that's why we got into that. So this is the idea that we're basically trying to get them to bracket this. In other words, somebody comes, they're stressed out, the market's down, and they want to get out. Well, we might take a bracketing approach, which is say, okay, yeah, we can definitely get out. Now, if the market's down, are you planning to spend that in the next couple of weeks? Oh, that's for your retirement? So you don't actually care where the market is right now. You care where it's going to be when you're 65, right? So why are you watching them? Why does this matter to you? Trying to get them to bracket that in a longer period of time where, like, things can go up and down, but we don't worry about it as much. Another example is dollar cost averaging. Dollar cost averaging is also an example of loss reframing. A loss becomes a buying opportunity. It's a buying opportunity to purchase more shares when they are cheap. For example, the gambler's fallacy. A loss is a buying opportunity to bring down average share cost. It's also known as sunk cost fallacy. However, these are great forms of loss reframing. So I'll end with this. Again, even if you don't believe in dollar cost averaging, it's still a really effective story. Even if the strategy is statistically invalid in the absence of security price mean reversion, it can produce better investor behavior. Why? Because it's reinterpreting a loss as something else. It's not a loss, it's a buying opportunity. We can disabuse clients of these statistical fallacies, but it may result in less time in the market and consequently lower returns. All right, so the summary, what did we find in this particular research? We found in an advisor intermediated stock market game, periods of advisor loyalty were neurally associated with an increased focus on the people and a decreased focus on the numbers. Advisor switching was neurally preceded by loss detection and error detection through number comparisons. Prospective loss reframing produces neurologically different responses to loss experiences, and it can help increase not only market participation, but advisor loyalty. And